Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Scot Bayless, and you're here to participate in the industry panel on less violent video game design. Now, this is something that a lot of us at CG Spectrum actually find a really interesting topic. And a lot of us as designers have had opportunities to get involved in video game design that isn't just about shooting things and blowing things up. There's a lot more to it, and we're going to talk about some of that today. So what I would like to do is give you a quick introduction to me, and then we'll talk a little bit about CG Spectrum, and then I'll introduce you to our panelists. So this is me. I'm Scot Bayless, Director of Game Development. That means I'm responsible for both game programming and game design. I've been in video games for, it's actually a little bit more than 35 years now. Started in the mid 80s as a programmer and worked my way into game design. Became a producer. I was a producer at Sega back in the halcyon days of Sonic the Hedgehog. But I was also a technical guy. In fact, I actually have a little bit of code in Sonic the Hedgehog too. So over my career, I was lucky enough to get involved in a lot of really big initiatives, including the launch of the original Xbox at Microsoft. I was also responsible for all of North America and European game development at Capcom, which was an extraordinary experience for me. So I've been exposed to a lot of different kinds of games and a lot of different circumstances. And I consider myself very lucky to be here talking to you guys about it now. CG Spectrum is a global top-ranked provider of online training in visual effects and in related fields like 3D modeling and virtual production, also animation, and of course, game development, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We use a model that's really kind of unique, and it's something that got me very excited when I first learned about it. And it's one of the reasons I'm here talking to you guys today. We focus really strongly on the mentor-student relationship because we've come to realize what a big impact that has. I mean, I think everybody has that teacher that at some time in their academic past that made a huge difference in their lives. And what we do is we try to cultivate that. And we find that it's extremely effective and produces a great experience both for the student and for the people that those students go on to work for in their careers. We have about 170 industry mentors. These are people who are actually doing the work. They're not former members of a team doing visual effects. They are actually doing visual effects. They're actually working on game projects. We have mentors from just about every major game studio in the world. We have an extremely high job acceptance rate for our graduating students. And that's because the mentors are able to help students learn how to do the job, to really do the job. And the studios that they go to know the difference. We have students across 90 countries. I think we actually have students in just about every time zone on the planet. And because of that, we have a thriving community. And one of the things that I also find really exciting about the way things work at CG Spectrum is the activity of the community that we maintain, mostly in Slack, where students from all over the world are constantly in communication with each other, challenging each other, helping each other. It's extraordinary. It's like nothing I've ever seen. We also provide pretty extensive career development services for students that are getting ready to graduate, and that has a significant impact. So that's a little bit about CG Spectrum. The courses that we provide kind of touched on this already, but just to go through them very quickly. Visual effects, we focus pretty strongly on Houdini because Houdini is one of the most ubiquitous tools in the visual effects world. Virtually everybody who works in VFX at some point is going to have to interact with Houdini. So we put a lot of effort into teaching people how to work with Houdini. And it turns out Houdini is now making its way into games as well. So its scope is broadening in the industry. We also teach 3D modeling, both in terms of hard surface and environment modeling and in terms of character modeling. Digital painting, concept art, digital illustration, those are skills that are constantly in demand in the industry. And while we're not really going to be talking about AI today, I can tell you that AI is not really a threat to the kinds of skills that we teach, because the skills that we teach go beyond what AI can do. Game development, we cover a large spectrum of game development topics, including game design, game programming, virtual production, and ISTQB certification. This is actually a certification for people who want to work in quality assurance in software development, and specifically in game software development. Interestingly, the pathway into game design and game production is often through QA. And so we offer that course. It's a relatively short course, but we offer it because it's a way for students to get their foot in the door. We also teach animation, both 2D and 3D, and we've just opened up a visualization program, which goes into things like architectural and product visualization, which at the moment is a rapidly growing business. Virtually every major maker of clothing or cars or personal electronics, they're all using visualization techniques, primarily in Unreal Engine, which is something we focus on. And so it's becoming kind of a thriving new space. So I want to introduce our panelists now, starting with Justin Howe, who is the head of game design at CG Spectrum. And Justin, are you there?
Yep, I am indeed.
So
hi, everybody. So my name is Justin Howe. I'm the recent head of game design here at CG Spectrum. You'll meet my predecessor very shortly. I have been interacting with video games and actually even going all the way back to tabletop game design back when that was a lot more common. I've been a technologist and supporting $100 million infrastructures as well. So I'm a bit of a weird duck amongst us, and then I've kind of moved between these industry spaces. But that's actually put me in a unique position where I've also been working with CG Spectrum now for the last couple of years, and I've also been working with Brock University in Ontario, Canada, in the Department of Digital Humanities. So while I have spent a lot of time in indie and AAA game design spaces, I've also had the opportunity to help students realize their talents not only with CGS, but in other environments where they do focus on a lot of sort of interesting, novel or unusual game concepts or game constructs, which is a big part of why I was excited to be part of the conversation today. And I'll pass back to you, Scott, for the other introductions.
Thanks, Justin. So then I'd like to introduce Troy Dunniway. Troy is kind of the big brain in game design here at CG Spectrum. Troy is one of the most experienced game designers in the world. He's also the author of most of the course content for game design at CG Spectrum. Troy was the head of the game design department, but has actually stepped back to focus his attention on curriculum, because we're expanding our game design curriculum and doing a passive kind of refinement and upgrading that is taking all of his time and energy. So we've very happily asked Troy to focus his attention there. He's having a huge impact, and we're really excited about the way that's going. So Troy, did you want to just give the gang a quick rundown?
Hey everybody. Yeah, so I helped create this course a long time ago now. That it was a passion for me to try to figure out how do we teach people in our teams better. And then I started realizing like the whole thing starts that students weren't being taught the right way. And so I started figuring out ways to teach my team, and that ultimately led into this course, which is a really hands-on practical thing. And I've really tried to take 35 years now of experience in designing games, over 100 games shipped, and I've worked for, all the big publishers and developers, and worked on lots of big franchises and stuff. But it's really about that, having the passion for game design, but really wanting to also teach people and mentor people into like really how to become a practical designer, and not being this theory kind of thing that you just kind of don't know what to do, right? And so I really tried to channel that into the course, and we're always making it better. And even today, talking about nonviolent games, like what's relevant today, not being caught up in like, well, we got to go get approvals and we'll talk about that years from now. Like, right. I changed this course monthly almost just to make sure that, you guys have the latest stuff. And so hopefully today this will inspire you guys and kind of show you how the hands-on practical side of our course and the community side of it really does come through, every week, every month in this school. It's a great place to be. And so, yeah, please come, join us today on this journey and check us out more if you have other questions about the game design program, especially, but I think you'll find it very special. So thanks, Scott.
That's awesome. Thanks, Troy. So then I'd like to introduce Ryan Laley. who is a successful YouTuber who's been actually teaching people about Unreal Engine and game design for quite some time now. We were lucky enough to lure Ryan to join the school, and he's one of our mentors. He's also one of our curriculum creators. So Ryan, take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, as Scott was just saying, I'm a CG Spectrum mentor and been so for about a year now. I'm an unauthorized trainer. Some of you may recognize me from my YouTube channel where I teach people Unreal Engine. But outside of that, I'm also been a trainer, consultant for many studios and individuals all over the world, and working directly with Epic Games to train individuals as well. I'm passionate about game design, and that's why I'm excited to be here for today's panel.
And we're excited to have you. So, okay, let's talk about less violent video game design. If we're going to have that conversation, I think the first thing we need to do is get a grip on what does less violent video game even mean. And in fact, what we really need to do is define violent games so that we have something to compare against. And Troy, I think, has a really interesting perspective on this. And in fact, we're going to talk about a little later on about a white paper that Troy put together that kind of started this whole conversation at CG Spectrum. But Troy, if you don't mind, I'd love to have you just jump in a little bit and talk about defining violent games and talk about the difference between challenge and conflict.
Yeah, the main thing, that the point of what we're trying to make today is not to make a judgment about, is violence good or bad? That's not our job. Our job is to make you think about what do you feel violence, is. And so the article I wrote and even today is really to help you start critically thinking about violence and what it means in a video game. Like, what is it actually doing? The mechanics that, why is that making a game maybe fun? Why is that making a game maybe scary? Why does it make a game, have an emotional reaction to it, right? And so really what violence in many games is doing is creating, some form of a challenge. It's creating something we do, that makes the game, I'll say, fun, like, right, for many people. And, but I want people to step back and say, there's non-violent games and there's very violent games. And then in the middle, there's this massive spectrum of what is, some forms of violence, like, is Mario violent? I jump around on, and bang on a turtle. Like, is that violent? Well, kind of, but that's not for us to say. But I want you to think about and ask these questions, right? And understand that what violence is doing is it's creating, some sort of engagement with players, and it's filling something there that makes them want to keep playing the game. But, is that the only way to make fun? Is that the only way to make a game exciting? Is that the only way to add diversity? Does it get boring after I pull out a gun and I shoot 10,000 people? What else can I do to make a game more interesting? That isn't just about, killing things and stuff. And so that's where this whole article kind of came from, is I wanted to inspire students to not just make violent games, and that they can, and that's not, there, but I wanted them to really take it to heart, to kind of go like, what else can I do? Right. And that's where this kind of came about. And so as I started to dive in myself, even in violence, and starting to realize, like, there can be verbal violence, right? There can be things of people yelling and screaming and in conflict verbally. It doesn't have to be physical violence. There can be emotional violence and even passive aggressive things. There's lots of ways that we can, have violence in games that isn't just a physical form of the obvious pull out a gun and kill people, right? And so, but I want you to see how that could impact people, and especially, it can impact different communities or different types of people from different races, religions. All these other things can be targeted directly or indirectly or even accidentally by game designers if you don't be aware of what these things mean, right? And what these things do. And so I want you to also have that in the back of your mind of kind of going, if I have a character in the game who says this, does that be offensive to somebody, like, right? And being aware of those kind of things. And that's where this article kind of comes to show you that violence, what you think is violent, might mean something very, very different to somebody else, right? And so started to ask that question of what is violence, right? And so I'd love to hear, from the rest of the team of, like, what types of violence do you see in games outside of just guns and things that you find are interesting, but not horribly, in the same vein of shooters? Like, what are some uses of violence or types of violence that you find it's there?
I think you mentioned some of these even in your white paper. Like, I think Oh Sir, the insult simulator, fun, clever little game, but it's all about creating clever insults to your opponent, and they do it in a very hilarious way. But there's a, it's taking that social conflict of, can I out insult, can I better yo mama in this kind of construct to come out ahead. I think that's a great example, and I love that you mentioned Mario, because we take for granted a lot of that. I mean, Kirby is a beast. He can eat the world. That's pretty violent. Like, he can consume everything. And I think that when we start seeing what's out there, we take for granted a lot of the time that we default to these presentations because they're so quick for us to set stakes. We can see that, yet another zombie game is familiar. We understand what's going on with it, but I think, even games like The Sims, depending on the context you want to look at, in The Sims, you're micromanaging the entire life of other individuals. There are people that could find that pretty creepy if you chose to interpret it that way. I don't think that's the case most of the time, but there's a lot of this stuff that gets baked in. I know I've seen a lot of well-meaning starter projects that, as you say, they bake in a certain set of assumptions that they're not necessarily cognizant over how that might feel as an attack on a different group. I actually saw this with one project where they were designing a game that they were actually trying to be very aware of. They were drawing off of the folklore of a given demographic, but then they made everyone associated with that particular culture, they automatically became the villains. Instantly, they sort of demonized them accidentally, made it so that it felt like you were attacking that group, even though that was 100% counter to their intent. I think that when we talk about what we see in the titles that are out there, what I think that is so important, as you say, is recognizing, just asking the question, hey, what is the context of how the violence operates in this game? Obvious physical violence, death, trauma, blood, guts, and gore, it's out there, and it's very easy to say, okay, well, that's a violent game. But I think that being cognizant of the other channels, whether it's social violence or even cultural violence, those things do matter, not because we're trying to make a big political statement, but you want to at least be aware of what you're embedding into your material. I think that that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's axiomatic that when you're talking about games, at some level, you're talking about challenge, right? There's a problem that you as the player are trying to face and overcome. The easy answer to challenge is quite often something violent, because we know how to interpret that really easily. But because it's an easy answer, it doesn't mean that it's a particularly interesting answer. I mean, does the world really need another horde of zombies chasing you around? Arguably, not really. I think we're going to talk a bit more about this downstream, about standing out and looking for ways to provide a challenge or a problem for a player to solve that's a little different from what they've experienced before. And I think that couples onto this, right? In a lot of ways, violence is the easy response to what do I do for a challenge, but it's by no means the only response, right?
Yeah.
So
real quick, so for those of you that don't quite understand what we mean by a challenge, just to make it really clear, again, games need something. Games are about engagement, right? A player needs to pick up a controller and do something in that game to make it fun. A walking simulator where I'm just walking around a level, might tell a story, and it might be a niche thing, and that could be a way of nonviolence. And there is games that are predominantly about exploring a world, and that's all they are. But you also need to realize that some players want a higher level of engagement. They want something that's going to be more adrenaline going there. And so that challenge might be platforming, like, right? Maybe you've got something where I'm, Mario again, or some kind of game where I'm bouncing around and I've got to time puzzles and things. And I'm doing that without any violence, right? But it's fun and it's exciting, it's engaging. So that challenge is, could be a puzzle even. How do I solve a puzzle? Each type of player wants different types of challenges, but it doesn't have to be, the challenge doesn't have to be, did I kill more people than somebody else, right? There's lots of things that are there, but the point is you also couldn't take a game like Call of Duty and remove all the guns and say like, oh, see, it's not a non-violent game and it's still fun, because the violence plays a role and a purpose in the mechanics and the engagement and, and that, again, that elusive fun. And so I want to make sure that people see that it's, there can be replacements for violence, but there needs to be something there in the first place in your designs to make that thing something that people want to keep playing. And what's that thing in there that really keeps people playing? It's the challenge, right? So whether that's even
exactly right.
competition, like, right? you could, even like paint guns, instead of having bullets, you could just be splattering them with paint. Games like Splatoon or whatever, like, right? You don't have to have guns, but that's one easy example of showing how you could use the mechanic of violence, but replace it with something that's slightly non-violent, right? So there's lots of things there, but it has that challenge, meaning that thing that keeps me wanting to come back. I'm going to come back because I'm killing my friends, or I'm splattering them more than other people, or I'm playing pranks on them, or pushing them off things or whatever. Like, right? But there's something there that makes me want to come back, and that's what a challenge is. And you can't remove challenge and still have a fun game usually. So
yeah.
And I think
Justin?
a big part of that is abstraction too, right? So I mean, knowing your background, Troy, like chess is a great example of this. And I saw a question in the feed about this, like board games, but chess is ultimately a battle abstraction. It's one army versus another army. There's an implied conflict in that, and yet the actual gameplay is arguably very nonviolent. It's very strategic. My piece takes your piece, but the implication was it was designed to simulate a battle. The conflict is still baked into the mechanics that's there. It doesn't have to be a battlefield, even though that was sort of what it was originally referencing. I find that there's Splatoon's a great example where we can take those strategic dynamics, but we don't have to commit to it being a violent spectacle to still get that same adrenaline surge or that thrill of competition. I think is a big part of how this stuff tends to manifest.
I think it's also worth pointing out that when we mean challenge as well, it's not just about challenging the player's skill. It can also be challenge their preconceptions and their understanding of anything, really. And you'll see when we go through some examples in a moment of some games that have done that in successful ways, where you're challenging the player in the way they think, in the way they feel, and the way they are their expectations of a game. The industry is full of great examples of games that you really only can really play once because it challenges your preconceptions, but once you know the trick, then it kind of goes. But that challenge is unique to that experience and makes it stand out and a whole worthwhile.
Well, and some of those challenges, while they may be one-offs, can be really enlightening and really exciting. I mean, it can be, sometimes those experiences can be almost life-changing. So there's a lot of power in challenges that aren't just about blowing things up. And in fact, that's a great segue. Let's jump over to look at some of those. So Justin, you had some really interesting thoughts about braid and what braid is in the context of nonviolent game design.
Sure. Like the actual gameplay in braid is very puzzle centric. It's a traditional platformer with some interesting time control mechanics. But when you're playing, it's never more violent necessarily. I mean, even though I can see we got a great big cannon on the screen here, but it's perhaps not the best selection of screenshots on our part, but ultimately it's not something we would think of as a violent toned game. Not at all. It's designed to be very accessible. I mean, the style is very cartoonish. It's very I want to say almost Van Gogh like in its presentation. Not an art person, so if I'm quoting the wrong artist, I apologize in advance. But one of the things that stands out about it is that the actual story in the background, because they chose to do this very accessible, puzzle-driven, playing with time, you're rewinding the story. But the actual story of Braid, and I apologize in advance for spoilers if you are not familiar with this title, the whole story of Braid is actually a fairly socially violent concept. I mean, the main character, you think you're the hero, but it turns out you're the villain. You are literally rewinding time back to the point where you're the problem. You have been the thing that has been chasing this woman you're obsessed with. The main bad boss guy, who's a knight, is actually trying to keep her safe from you. He hasn't kidnapped her at all. It's showing the difference of perspective. That's a really powerful tool from a game creator standpoint. You can have the mechanics, you're able to drive the story forward. Even the idea that you're rewinding time to sort of come to terms with this. That's not something you can do as easily if your focus in the moment is extremely violent gameplay. There are a couple of games that have done that really well, but they're very few. I think Spec Ops: The Line is a very good example of one that really does that script flipped very well. But it really forces you to deal with a certain level of specific visceral horror to do it. This is a much more compelling way to tell that type of story and make you really examine this when it is subtle, when it's not obvious. Those types of, Braid was very successful. It's an excellent title, but it's the kind of thing where it anchors you to a different point of reference. And that's useful, not just for narrative purposes, but to get the person to experience the story so that the reveal is meaningful, so that there's a draw and a connection between their actions that's you're drawing on the subtlety to connect them to the material. And I think that's really powerful stuff at the end of the day.
And Justin, I'll interject real quick.
Go ahead.
Back to even your chess point and related to this, the way we show violence, you could take the exact same violence, like a guy with a sword in sword fighting, but like in chess, that's implied. You know, it's abstracted out all the way to every extreme of you could see them actually fighting. You could be, you know, doing blood and guts and gore and super, you know, the worst, you know, type of violence and dismemberment and everything else. So even within the spectrum of violence, and that was one thing, there's still hundreds of ways you can represent that gets worse and worse and worse for some, you know, and not others. And so you have to kind of think about, like, even in that spectrum of a sword fight or a gunfight, like there's a lot of ways to take it, right? This is not a black and white area. This is
it is a huge arc. I completely agree.
And that's why I like this is a good, even though this has that canon, it's a good thing to show. It's cartoon violence. And so again, that has a certain type of representation, but it's very different than, you know, a super, you know, hardcore, you know, mature rated kind of horror game or something like that can go violence in other ways, like, right?
Yeah.
You
Right.
know,
But dealing with no less serious a topic. Yeah, no, I
Exactly.
totally agree with you.
Right. And hold that thought, because we're going to come back to the representation and the impact of representation on the perception of violence. So, you know, Journey, I think, is another really interesting example of essentially a nonviolent experience that is also compelling on a bunch of different levels. I mean, it's essentially a game about traversal in order to reveal beautiful, lyrical, emotionally compelling events and vistas. And there really isn't any direct conflict in the game as you might interpret it in a violent game. It's really more about revelation and exploration and discovery. And so I think it makes a really good example of gameplay that, while challenging and in some cases even difficult, is rarely about destruction or injury or direct conflict with other characters. It's more about finding things out, which, as it turns out, with human beings is a really compelling kind of gameplay experience. So let's just really quickly look at these two. Actually, Ryan, I think you're probably most familiar with these games. So yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, so Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is an amazing game. If you haven't played it, which many people didn't actually play it at the time, so I do recommend checking it out. It's a game where you control these two boys, and as they go on a journey to save their father, and that's the gist of the story. The most of your gameplay in there is puzzle solving. Now, what's really clever about this game, and what makes it a good point of discussion for today, is that, does it have violence? Technically, yes, because it deals with things like death and heartbreak and loss. And there's even a bit where you have to solve a puzzle by something about blood. You have to fill up the blood level or something. But at no point do you feel like I'm committing acts of violence. It's ultimately an exploration and puzzle game. But this is what I'm saying when I said about challenging your preconceptions and what you expect the game to be. This is definitely one of those games that as you get towards the end, which I won't spoil, but when you get towards the end, that preconceived notion of what you're expecting to happen doesn't. And it kind of makes you appreciate the story and how well it's told through this medium. And it's one of those games which does a great job of marrying game design, level design, and even just the technical inputs of the player to the game that you're playing and the story that you're perceiving. The Witness, funny enough, was also made by Jonathan Blow, just like Braid was. And Witness is a pure puzzle game. Okay, it's pure exploration and puzzle. There's not even a jump button for your character. Okay, you just simply explore and solve these puzzles that you see here on the screen, and they're all over this island that you're exploring. And as Jonathan Blow likes to do in these games, like Braid, there's lots of subtext and undertones and hidden meanings and what you can perceive from what you're looking about. Like, for example, there's loads of like weird statues of people like frozen in a statue or something. Weird stuff going on, and it makes you curious about what you're seeing in the world and makes you want to spend hours in it. And it is a long game with lots of hidden little gems for you to find. So yeah, two great examples of games. If you haven't played them, I do recommend checking them out.
One more I just thought of that I wanted to mention is a game called This War of Mine, which is one that I really love. And it's a side scroller game. If you guys haven't, if you haven't played it, check it out, because it's about being in the middle of a war and the impact that the war has on the people inside of it, the children and those kind of things. And yeah, there's a little bit of violence. The players occasionally have to kill somebody or do something, but it really shows the impact of violence and war and conflict and those things at an emotional level that I've never experienced before in another game. But there's
It's not gratuitous at all. It's not gratuitous violence. Like when you're the consequence of action is baked throughout it. I think it's a great recommend, Troy.
Yeah, and it's a great way to show that you can even not even necessarily make a stance about whether war is good or bad or whatever, but expose people to violence in ways they don't have to do the violence themselves. They may be running from the violence. They may be helping people, healing people, doing other things, but they're in a violent situation. Like, right? So think about that in how you think about violence too. It's not just the player, all about the player's actions, but the world, the environments, the stories, and that situation can put them into situations that forces them maybe to not be violent or maybe to do other things. And so turn it around that way. And it's not just about player action, right? And that's what I love about this war of mine, is it really flips the script in a great way.
Yeah, absolutely. So this I actually find this question really interesting, and I'm hoping we can get some good discussion on this. We've talked a bit about what does it mean to be violent in a video game, what were the implications of that. We talked about some alternatives to obvious direct violence, but that's an interesting question. Why would you make a less violent game? And I'll tee this off by sharing an observation that I made not long ago, where I was doing some research on the video game market. As it turns out, the amount of money generated in the video game market is about evenly split between games that would arguably be called violent in some way and games that are not violent at all. And I personally find that really interesting. The perception I think a lot of people have is that video games are kind of about violence, and it turns out that really isn't so. And in fact, it's becoming less so over time as, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, about why that's starting to happen. So, the question, do I need to make a shooter game? The answer is, in the context of learning how game design works, shooters are actually very effective as vehicles for teaching you a lot of the core principles of game design. But it's by no means the only kind of game that's interesting to explore. And I'd love to hear from you, Troy, about your perspective on this.
Yeah, again, this article originally came from the fact that in our second term of the course, there was actually our main assignment, our main project was actually to build a shooter, because that was, to me, we're trying to keep something kind of contained, a little bit simpler, and it was about something you can kind of understand and lots of reference for it. It's really easy to do in the Unreal Engine, all these kinds of things. But a lot of students kind of went, wait, do I got to kill things? Do I need to build that shooter? And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like it's about building action games. And so in the course, we are focused on making more PC console, more, mainstream games, action kind of games, things like that. We're not building puzzle games and things. And so today's conversation isn't about the Candy Crushes and those kinds of obvious things there, but I think it is about, again, understanding what is it about what makes a game fun and engaging, and getting yourself to kind of understand how do you create those challenges again, that make it interesting. And so whether you built a pure jumping game or, a pure platforming game that only had movement in it, there's been games that were purely parkour, like, right. And stuff like that, and so you could make an entire game out of that. But then it's like, well, how do you make that risky? It has to be kind of like risk reward. Can I die? How do I succeed? How do I fail? Those kind of things. And and you start looking at the pure theory of it. And I don't like to be academic in my course. I really want this course to be very practical, hands-on, like, right. So try not to get too researchy that way. But I think you start to realize that, like, these two things are, let's say, two sides of the same coin, like, right. That violence and nonviolence both serve the same purpose if done right. And if you understand what they're doing for players, then it makes it, you can still make things engaging without the violence. And so I found it personally very, because it wasn't something I had sat down in my 30 plus years of making games and really had had that conversation with myself to go, like, what is violence and how do I make a nonviolent game? And how do I really go out of my way to do this? And it was a really amazing thing for myself, that journey when I was writing this, of just like, how do I do that? And it really opened my own eyes into realizing that, yeah, there's a lot of other ways besides violence that we can really keep players, engaged and keep them, excited, and stuff. You like a sport, why do we all watch soccer or football or, any kind of sport? It's, we like the competition and that back and forth. Maybe American football and stuff might be a little violent, but but that's again in that spectrum, like, right. So for me, I think there's lots of opportunities to, again, you don't have to make a non-violent game. Again, I want to differentiate the like zero violence versus some spectrum of some form of it and what it is, but at least ask yourself, why do I have that? Why do I need to give them a gun? Why do I need to do this? What is that doing in the game and in that mechanic to again make it fun?
I think that's actually really interesting. And you reminded me of something. So have you guys all played Mirror's Edge?
Yes.
I'm thinking of the original one. Okay. So Mirror's Edge, I always had this impression of Mirror's Edge. And if anybody's watching this, if they're a huge Mirror's Edge fan and I'm offending them, my apologies in advance, but I've always found Mirror's Edge a little weird in that the parkour kind of felt separate from some of the other things you do in the game. And my personal opinion is that the parkour elements of Mirror's Edge were enough, that well presented and well structured in the designs of levels, that would have been enough for the game. You didn't need some of the other gameplay elements. It could have just been a game about parkour and evasion. And I'm curious about whether you guys would agree with that, or if not, why would you challenge it?
I would. I absolutely.
I would.
Go ahead, Ryan.
I would say it's exactly the same as, like, if you look at Assassin's Creed, for example, how it started as this stealth game. It's violent, but you're primarily your active gameplay looping that is stealth and research and stalking people. As we've gone on in the years, we've led to it being more of an action game where it's just you don't have to stealth. You can literally just go in and just murder everything you see.
Just slug your way through it. Yeah.
Just slug your way through it. But now we've seen Ubisoft have gone full circle, and with their new release, it looks like they're going back to that more stealthy approach and realize the error of their ways and going, maybe we shouldn't give the player a giant axe to swing around or special abilities like that. And I think that is a great thing for a company to actually realize the fact that they've lost that identity, that's what made that game unique at that time. And everyone complains now that Ubisoft games all feel the same, all have the same sort of mechanics and so on. So it's good to see them going back to, trying to go back to what made Assassin's Creed unique and stand out from its competitors.
It's a really good point. And stand out is the operative phrase, right? I mean, it's the easy answer is rarely the answer that's going to stand out. And I think for a while, Ubisoft was chasing the easy answer. And there are a bunch of reasons that can happen, right? I mean, making video games is hard and expensive, but I'm sorry, you were going to say something, Justin?
Go ahead. I'll let you finish. Go right ahead.
No, that's all right. I just ran out of steam. Go ahead.
Okay. So it's funny you said, the easy answer. And I think there's a couple things for that. Like to Troy's point, I think there's really good arguments. Like, does it need to be a shooter game, or that arc of violence? Like, what's how violent is violent? Lord of the Rings Online, I think, does a great job. At least when they launched, I think this is still true. You don't have a health bar, you have a morale bar. When you lose a fight, even though this is a story about Middle Earth, a very violent setting, they made a point of, you don't die, you're defeated. They really wanted to make sure there was a reason your hero could come back and fight another day. Like, there's contextual value to that for us as designers. I think when we're not committed to, no, he has to explode in a bunch of fleshy gobbets, when we're willing to walk it back from that, we get a lot more room to maneuver, even mechanically and experientially. It gives us more to work with. But to what you're saying about like where we make those defaults, we've talked about this internally. The push in our industry for greater photorealism, greater fidelity of graphic. This idea that we keep pushing towards real. Well, but when we do that, we lose freedom because we keep anchoring to, what feels like stakes or threat that matches the real world. We lock onto that. I think it pulls us to certain types of things. Even Assassin's Creed's a great example. The more real it had to be, the more contextually, I'm an assassin, I should be able to just stab that guy. The more that anchors into something like Assassin's Creed, it pulls them a certain way until you stop in excess of like, is this really where we want the time and experience to go? It takes real work to be more creative than that. That's an easy, that is an easy default for us a lot of the time, but and I'm not saying it's lazy, but it is certainly familiar. And
Mhm.
we are creatures of habit. We pull to defaults all the time, whether, you know, as players or as designers. I think that that's a big part of what makes that standout factor so much more powerful here. If we can go forward and say, okay, what about this gives this point of distinction? We can tailor the violence in this system so that it makes the focal point stand out, it delivers without being committed to, no, I just have to make this fully realistic. I don't have to make this completely plausible.
So I have a question for you guys. Would you argue that as realism goes up, the emotional impact of violence also goes up exponentially? I mean, cartoon violence, if you think, you know, Bugs Bunny, or you know somebody saying I'm getting blown up, you know, by a powder keg, something like that. That it's violent, but I think the emotional impact of that violence is very different from a super realistic scene in which somebody is, you know, disemboweled by a sword or whatever. My sense is that as you as you cross the uncanny valley, the emotional impact of violence starts to escalate really, really fast, to the point that it becomes maybe even intolerable, you know, if you take it far enough. I mean, does that make sense, or am I seeing it the wrong way?
I think that makes sense. I think, although I think you can also argue that if you push it really far and to the other extreme, and it returns back to being cartoony. And I think a great example of that is Mortal Kombat. If you look at, say, the violence in Mortal Kombat, yes, it's really, really graphic, really, really gratuitous.
It's insane. Yeah.
If you saw that on a film, that level of violence, it would probably make you feel sick, and that film would probably be banned. But with Mortal Kombat, where it goes to that extreme, where it's just so over the top, so almost cartoonish even. Like, it doesn't register on the same level as like gunning people down in an airport in Call of Duty versus chopping someone's head off in Mortal Kombat. It's a different level. Yeah. I think it's just because it pushes to the other end of the spectrum, until it's off the cliff into that crazy over the topness.
And with the emotional impact, to your question, Scott, like, I think Ryan's right that there's a split there, but I think you also hit the I think it's the double-edged sword of, in the context, again, is going to matter a lot, but you can have it has greater emotional impact until you see it all the time and we start working desensitization. You know, and I know there's a lot of data about this. People who are much smarter than I am have researched the crap out of this. But I think that's where, you know, it's even why are we arguing now about Marvel movies? Like, is it we've seen the superhero thing done so many times. Now are we just, there's nothing new or engaging there. For the record, I am not beaten on Marvel movies. I quite enjoy them, but I do get the argument that, it's another superhero movie, or it's another zombie game, or it's yet another World War II, the sequel shooting game, right? It's the
right.
We see this all the time. So I think there's a push to that. It does increase impact in certain things. Certainly in horror movies where you feel you're at risk. Alien Isolation, I think, is a brilliant example of that. But that is definitely a game where I think the risk of violence is very clear, even though a lot of it is, they try to balance it to they use a lot of Hitchcock principle there, where they show you just enough to freak you out and then they pull the camera away so your brain fills in the rest. That's powerful.
Well, the subject of the violence is another thing that's related to that. Who am I doing the violence against, and how is that done? Shooting and blowing up an alien, that doesn't feel violent because it's not a human, right? Doing that to a soldier has another thing. Doing it to a little child, totally different, right? And so even the context of who I'm doing it against and why is important to understand in violence, and understanding those things, right? And so it really makes you kind of think about why am I doing that? Why is it okay to kill a bunch of aliens but not this or that, right? And there's definitely lines we don't want to cross, but we need to be aware of them as game designers, at least, and understand that they do exist, right?
Yeah,
that's what's
totally.
And so there's one less. Sorry, go ahead, Troy.
No, I was just say real quick on that, stand out the busy market. So again, what we're trying to do is evangelize diversity of gameplay, new experiences, new things you can do in stuff that will not, that could enhance or replace or diversify the games and the stuff you're doing, but also be careful, because in the case of, say, Mirror's Edge, and maybe that's a bad example, but sometimes there's a type of player that wants action, right? So if you have the super hardcore action stuff, and then suddenly you throw in, say, puzzles or strategy or something else, one player likes one thing and then you give them another one. And sometimes peanut butter and jelly go together super well, and sometimes they don't. Like, right. And so you have to be careful that when putting in non-violent and less violent stuff into other violent situations, they can clash and they don't want to go together. And that's not what players necessarily want. So be really careful when you start having like different genres of things. You think, well, I can diversify and add less violence by removing something and replacing it with something else. You got to ask yourself, who's your users? Who's your players? What do they want? Is that something they're actually wanting to do as well? So be really careful with these tools and techniques, because it's very easy to take it into a situation where, like, you know, I wanted to play a puzzle game and now you're making me do a bunch of these other action-y things, and that's not what I wanted, right? And so be careful about that.
That is so true. Yeah, that's a really good point.
I just want to follow on from what Troy was saying, in that yes, we want to make sure we are selling the game that, well, people are playing the game we sold them. And when we're thinking of solutions about diversifying their experience in the game, I think if we were to look at a great example, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, if you were to point out at one level in particular that stood out amongst all the other levels, I reckon most people will pick up all gillied up, where you don't actually shoot anyone. I think you shoot one bullet at the end of that level.
Right, you fire one round.
That's the one people have taken away from them. It's like, that is stuck in my brain forever. But that worked because it worked in the context of the genre of the game that it was in. It's an army simulator, and in this one, you're a sniper sneaking behind enemy lines. It made sense. So we're just changing the context of what we're doing in the level, and that really helps out with the pacing of the whole entire game. So not just level to level, but over the course of the whole entire game, we want to make sure that the pacing feels unique and different. Like, every level feels a bit different from the last one. Halo does this very well, where you have maybe a vehicle level, a race level, a level where you're just going down all the time, a horror level. It played around with that gameplay a lot to give a good variety in there. Yes, it's still violent. Yes, it still has violence, but as we're always as we've been trying to say this whole time, it's not about removing the violence. It's about diversifying it and adding more to it, more layers to it, and not just saying like, oh, I need this to be more challenging, let's just throw a few more zombies or space marines in here. That's not the answer. The answer is taking a look, okay, what would make sense for this game that I'm designing?
And I think that's it. It's about, you know, what we're really arguing here is that for game designers, it's about contextual risk. What's the risk that fits this context? There's lots of ways to do that. I think that's actually brings you back to the Mirror's Edge example. You know, you could still have a fantastic parkour game, but it wouldn't be the cyberpunk setting with the risks of Mirror's Edge if you didn't have the guards with some sort of recognizable cyberpunk type threat where they're armed. And what do I do when I encounter the armed guard? I think you could remove the guards explicitly, but and still have a very effective parkour driven game, but they were put there to be, you know, so that they're, if you are about movement, they are the flypaper. I mean, that is literally the logic that's applied. I don't think it has to be an armed guard, but it fit the context that they were using, and they kept the scope of how it worked in a very specific and particular way. That contextual risk is the tool we want to lean on. That's how we, you know, looking at our slide, that's how we can show off a mechanic. That's how we can explore unique ideas. Contextual risk matters, but that gives us a lot more room to maneuver than go directly to hand grenade, go directly to gunfire, go directly to stab the other dude. I think that's the thing. Like, we have range here that I don't know that our industry leverages as much as any of us would like to see, but I am really glad to see we're seeing so much more of it now, because it's giving us far more interesting things to play.
Yeah. Well, so would you, to that point specifically, would you say that some of that is driven by the improvement of the tool suite that people have available to them to build games, because it empowers people to do stuff they couldn't do before? I mean, there are solo developers now who are making full-blown games, top to bottom, with extraordinary quality. And that feels like opportunity to me. I mean, it feels like it's an opportunity for people to try stuff out that you know, a team in a AAA studio just wouldn't be able to do.
And that is 100% true. The more we open our tools up, the more content and more rich content we're going to get, and more diverse content we get. And it's just like how when YouTube kicked off, and we now see people doing their own public access shows, in their basements using their own camera systems. And now, because cameras are getting better and better, people are using their phones, and their phones are doing 4K video. It's exactly the same for film as it is for games. We can now pump out AAA quality games at relatively low cost. And
Mhm.
not only that, but also stand out by marketing ourselves. Lots more
Mhm.
governments around the world are offering charities or tax breaks to various game studios and funding. So
Mhm.
in your area, check out, look at your local councils and governments and
Mhm.
see what funding is available to you, because you'll find there's a lot of opportunity, and you'll, especially for games that are less violent or non-violent, you're going to see a lot more opportunity come your way when it does come to that funding, because people are more more inclined to offer their services and help you try these things out. And
Mhm.
and so there's more shows going on everywhere. There's more chances for you to get your name out there as an independent developer and
Yeah.
make a name for yourself and stand out. And if you stand out, that makes it easier for you to get a job in the industry as well, and also or just carry on being solo and independent and making more of
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually changing the way game publishers work. When I got into the business, game publishers were the primary funding source for games. And they essentially commanded all game development. I mean, it was a bit like the studio system in the early days of movies, right? They commissioned movies to sell popcorn. That's what they did. And now it's not that way at all. Most smaller publishers are now really marketing operations that serve indies. That's a huge change from the way things were even a decade ago.
Watching our community chat here, which I think hits the notes that all three of you have been making. People were talking about Stray, small studio game, less violent, it has real action, it has real challenge, it has all that baked into it, and it leveraged the leap in technology, taking all of those types of extra tools and accessibility and applying it to a new, interesting, novel concept, and it captured all sorts of attention. I think Stray's a great example. Which it didn't occur to me right away, but seeing our guests today talk about it, I think it's a really good thread the needle example.
It's an excellent catch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool stuff, guys. So we're starting to run a little bit low on time here. So let me see if I can move us forward a little bit.
This was always the risk.
Yeah. Well, we like talking about this stuff. So we've talked a little bit about this already, about designing less violent games. And Troy made the point previously about intentional design and choosing what you do with violence or any other element of a game experience intentionally as opposed to by accident. But Troy, did you have other things you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it. I just want everybody to be thinking about, these things and looking for ideas and suggestions and, for their teams to know, is this something we want to do or not? Like, right. And just understand, is this, and it may not be that you can take a Call of Duty and remove all the violence. And that's not what we're suggesting, but it's really about, again, having that intention of what and why am I building something, like, right. And just be thoughtful, and just kind of understanding that. And just use it as even if it's just a pure thought exercise and you never build a nonviolent game in your life, it's still a great thing as a human being to really understand what makes us tick, right? And what make, and why do players, want certain things. You may even find that you might make a better set of violence or a different type or whatever, like, right? By understanding the purity of what that mechanic really means to a player and to, and why that engages them, right? So this is like psychology really of what we're talking about. And so I just encourage everybody to take it to heart a little bit, be a little philosophical about it, but also look at the practical side of it, right? And that's what I think is exciting about this, is that there's a lot more things we can really do in today's world, in today's market, today's game place that we couldn't do 5 or 10 years ago. The market just wasn't there yet, right? And I think there's more opportunity now for a lot of this stuff. So take that to heart and and see what new things you can do, right? And that's, I think, what's important. But again, just remember, when you take violence out, remember that there's got to be a replacement for it, and that's the important thing.
Right. I noticed somebody was making a comment about the Steam summer sale. And yes, me too. I'm spending too much money, but Steam is, I think, another great example of how the world has changed, right? Digital distribution has made it possible for a solo dev or a very small team to get something out in front of the world and find success. I mean, it's certainly not guaranteed, but it wasn't even possible a decade ago. You couldn't, or 15 years ago, you couldn't even do it. There was no vehicle for getting that stuff in front of people who might really find it entertaining. Now it's becoming commonplace. And I think that's really empowering. I mean, it gives you the opportunity to try stuff with your vision for a game with your own approach to intentional design, whether it's violent or not violent, it gives you room to try things that maybe nobody has ever tried before. I find that really exciting. So cool. Well, so this is an opportunity for us to just talk a little bit about Troy's guide to less violent video game design. This started with a white paper that Troy put together actually a little while back, but it's gotten us thinking really hard about how we talk about game design, how we approach game design, and so we're going to make this available to you guys, I think, in an email that you'll get after this session is done. But Troy, is there anything you wanted to say about what's there and how people should approach it?
Yeah, in short, I mean, right now the raw document's being edited and cleaned up, but it's about 25, 30 pages. So it's not a short little thing of just like, here's a couple little ideas. About half of the document is really about the theory of violence and the types of violence and how it's used and those kinds of things. And then the other half, I really deep dived into ideas and just brainstorming on like, how can you actually design games, and dived into lots and lots and lots of different examples of like competition and creating new choices and different types of stealth mechanics and all these kind of things. And so, looking at, collection mechanics and exploration mechanics and all that kind of stuff. So I've got like a good 10 or 15 pages of ideas around there that actually should be very practical, hands-on, that actually you can use in your game designs, to hopefully make it. So it's not just a pure theory article of like, about violence and taking a stance. I actually really wanted to put stuff in there that will help you with your ideation, and your brainstorming processes for how do I now actually use this and implement it. So I think this article should be useful for a lot of you, so it's, again, should be a great critical thinking exercise, at least at a minimum.
Yeah, I thought it was a great read, but it's
Agreed.
Not a short read. it's really not. It's pretty dense, but there's a lot of great stuff in there. So
and it's targeted if you are trying to think about like, what do I really want to do here? What am I trying to like, how do I make choices so that this is deliberate? I'm not kind of stumbling. I think Troy's given an excellent, these are the questions you want to be asking yourself. This is what you want to, how you make sure you're making choices. You're not just reacting. I think it's especially if you're sort of approaching these types of issues for the first time, like, how do I make sure I'm doing what I want to do with these types of materials? I think Troy's guide's a really great place to keep people honest with themselves as part of their development process. It's a really good place to operate from.
I completely agree.
I hope you all enjoy it. So
yeah, though I did. So this is our social footprint. Feel free to reach out to us at any time if you guys have questions about this seminar or any other topic that you guys are interested in. And I think you'll also get these in the email that you'll get. And then what I'd like to do is turn it over to questions. So I'll moderate, and I'm going to ask the gang to help me address some of these questions. So I'm going to work my way down the list from the top. And as usual, there's some great questions in here. So top of the list, and this is from James, the top 7 games on Steam by daily player count, which amount for millions of players, are violent PvP experiences. What are your thoughts on designing engaging PvP experiences that are less violent?
I'll take this one.
Take it. Run with
it. Obviously, conflict and challenge are a big thing to deal with when it comes to competition. But when you look at some of the popular multiplayer games out there, not all of them, obviously, a lot of them are going to be violent, but some of them I wouldn't class as violent video games. And those are going to be the games like Among Us, Minecraft, these sort of games, Roblox, for example. These games aren't all about violence. They have violence in them, but that's not the core thing. Yes, Among Us, you're killing people, but it's that. The main part of that game is the social deduction part, the part where you are working together and against each other to solve a problem. It's sort of like how escape rooms became popular. You're not beating each other up in the escape room, you're trying to solve a problem together. And I think these PvP experiences do exist, and I think we forget that they do exist and what their main draw is. Most people in Minecraft are just building collaboratively. Most people in Roblox are just running gauntlets and talking to each other. And Among Us, people are just arguing about who is who. And
I think Ryan is sus.
Yeah, exactly. And I say, like, I'm making a game myself, which is all about social deduction. Yes, there's violence in it, but if you were to ever go through all my game design documents, you'd see that violence really rarely comes up in conversation. It's mostly all about how can I make people lie and shout at each other. That's mostly where it comes from. It's like I want people to distrust each other and play social reasoning and bring back that. Someone mentioned about board games earlier. Bring that board game mentality back to video game sort of discussion. So yes, they will always be popular, but don't forget there are other popular games. There's more than 7 PvP experiences out on Steam.
Yeah. Excellent points. So let's do another one here. This is from Andrew. Do you think non-violent experiences fit the violent game genre? Jedi Fallen Order and God of War are violent games that try to mix together harmless elements of puzzles. And then it goes on to say, I usually get annoyed by that because if I want to play a harmless game, I'll choose a different game. So this kind of speaks to your comment, Troy.
Yeah.
About making sure that elements of the design actually fit together in some productive way. Do you have any other thoughts you wanted to add to that? Or?
Yeah, it's just, you have to be clear, I think, when you market and sell to people that this is kind of the game you're getting. And there's nothing against, again, these different things. If it's taken in context, like Ryan's example of Call of Duty and, being in the ghillie suit or whatever example, like it fit because it was part of the promise and the experience and the user, that the user expects to be in like a special forces thing. But, if you were the badass Rainbow Six guy, and then suddenly I'm off baking cakes or something, you'd be like, whoa, wait, why am I baking cakes? That doesn't make any sense. Like, right. So a lot of this is contextual, like why do those things exist? So the more that we can integrate those in the player expectations up front, but also about it being who we are, that will help these things kind of fit together. But I think it's like Mirror's Edge is a good example. Like I'm doing parkour and then suddenly I'm fighting, but why am I fighting? Like it doesn't, sometimes they don't fit together. And so that's what we have to set up, right?
Yeah,
and
so avoid the non sequitur. Go ahead.
I want to piggyback on that, but I mean, I think there is a place for those. I don't even say, again, it's not just about non-violent, but less violent or other contextual activities. Why are survival games popular? This is ultimately about gathering, like you might be farming for Pete's sake on your survival game, gathering goods, you're planting stuff, you're building your base up. That is ultimately about as less violent as it gets, unless you really hate trees, chopping them down, or cracking rocks. But the reality is that's there. But then the conflict. Not every survival game has violent outcomes. Doesn't have I can go raid another base, but they're still very popular. Why do I have a risk of disasters to my city? There is, I think that you still have, there are contexts that naturally blend non-violent, strategic, and or less violent presentations of conflict that work really well. But it's about make sure it fits. I think to Andrew's question, I think the bigger issue there is in those, it just feels jarring when you switch gears.
Right.
It's not that's a pacing problem. That's actually not necessarily a content problem. And by the way, there's a lot of good things about those, those genres of games. Like God of War's got a following for a reason. And maybe there's a reason to break up the pacing with that, to mix it up so that you get a reset to put the player into a calmer state before you dial the adrenaline back up. There are reasons to do that. They have varying degrees of success. So I think there's a place for that. I think there's even a reason to integrate those things. It's smart because you're varying the experience and pacing of your play, but that doesn't mean that somebody gets it right every time, and it can create that jarring. I'm like, hang on, why am I doing this now? Right. And I think that's a big part of the way that has to be presented to the player.
Well, it's also what we haven't really exactly mentioned is, do we provide multiple paths, right? Is it always that this is only the way to play, or do we provide many ways to play? A game like Thief or something where I can sneak through, or another game I can fight through, or I can do either one, and that's where now the player has that choice to take the violence. And maybe there's even, like, again, some games have had meters, like if I kill the wrong people, I sort of become a bad guy. And that's not wrong to do. They can play, but actions have consequences, right? And that's what I like about game design is you can kind of say, well, if I help these people, maybe I get more status in this faction. If I attack these people, I get a different faction status, like, right? And that, these guys get angry, these guys get happy, these guys are my friends and my enemies. And all those things start to matter, and the world starts to feel more real and alive. And that's where I find that like this idea of like the point of the violence, right? If it has a purpose, again, can be interesting, and to explore that area there is exciting. But I think that's where that, again, some of these games force it on you, and that's why it gets, I think, jarring sometimes, right?
Deus Ex and Dishonored both do a good job of talking where you're talking about, where you're really getting contextual choice. Both are very, I'm not going to say they're not violent centric games. They absolutely are. You're fighting a lot, but they do give context of your choices. Am I trying to suppress? Am I trying to not kill everybody as I go along? Like they're building in options to give you those contextual hooks like you're talking about. I think that's absolutely right on the money.
And I just want to go to his last sentence. He was talking about like how he usually gets annoyed by that, because if he wants to play a harmless game, he would choose a different game. He wouldn't pick one of those games. But I think this goes down to something that is quite common when it comes from game design versus a game player, is that a game player typically doesn't realize what they know what they want. So when they say like, I don't want to do this, I'm just going to hack and slash the whole entire day long. If you were to do that in a game, you'd probably realize straight away how bored and tired out you are of that experience, because it's non-stop. So that's where we're talking about pacing and how pacing can really help vary up the gameplay. So it may be something that you like needn't sign up for, but it may be something that is like a site, like is in there to help you enjoy those moments a bit more. If we take God of War's example, the final battle on that is tremendous, great, bombastic fun, but it only means so much because it's had lots of setup with character development and cutscenes and things like that. It only means that much. Yeah, it only means that much. If it was just bombastic combat all the way through, when we got to those conflicts, the things that should matter to us as a game player, they won't anymore. It will just be another tick box off the list. And that's why we want to slow people down and pick them back up again all over the place, because it gives that gravity to what you are doing in the game.
I mean, Ryan's got a great point there that sometimes, again, we need that emotional attachment. Violence is about creating emotion, right? And, an engagement through that. And so, like, I played a game recently, it's kind of like John Wick, where the very beginning of the game, they kill your wife, and that's supposed to be the whole impetus of why you're pissed off. You're going to go kill them, but you get to see your wife for like 10 seconds, and then she's dead. So I have not, as a player,
that's awesome.
I have not built an emotional attachment there, versus a game where maybe I play with this character for hours and hours and hours, and then suddenly they die and they're ripped away from me, and I'm like, oh crap, that had meaning because I really built that attachment to them. That was much stronger than just sort of like, oh, we're just going to kill somebody. And that violence it wasn't something that mattered to me because I didn't have that contextual relationship with it. Right. And so, so Ryan's absolutely right that pacing and stuff allows us to sometimes build those types of things, those emotional connections and other things that then strengthen. Then when it's this contrasting thing where now when the violence happens, it has a lot more meaning than just, again, we get desensitized if it's just constant violence, right? And so that's something we have to really understand.
No,
I think a great example of that is if you look at Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. I wager money that people can't tell me the other bad guys from 8, 9, 10, 12, and so on. And the reason
somebody with a sword.
Someone with a sword, yeah. The reason why we remember Sephiroth is because he's present throughout the whole entire game. He's non-interactive for most of the game. You don't actually fight him until the very end of the game. You see him plenty of times, and he kills one of your characters at the end of the first disc. It's not a spoiler; it's been out for God knows how long. But he kills one of your characters, and everyone remembers that death. Everyone remembers that moment, feeling like, "Oh my God, you just killed my healer! Like, she was my healer. What are you doing?" And when we got to that pivotal moment where we go, "Okay, this is it, the final battle against F1." It meant so much more. And this is why, as a character, he has lasted endlessly, because at the end of the day, he's just a guy with a long sword. That's all he is. He's just a samurai, basically. And the fact that they built up his character with those slow moments and with the character development and with the moments of emotion being attached to him, he felt like a such more personal final boss. And in comparison, if you took it like Final Fantasy X for that, the second from last boss has lots of emotional attachment to you. He's your father. Again, spoiler alert. He's your father. You're fighting your father. He's a big monster. But then the secret last boss that reveals itself, you don't really care about. You're like, okay, this is to people, they don't count that as the last boss because they're like, I don't care about this. but it's just something that you have to complete for the sake of the story.
Right.
So yeah, emotional context definitely matters, and that's why we put it in there.
A quick analogy that I think is interesting to look at is if you think about television shows, right? And seasonal things that have episode after episode, Star Trek or whatever, like, right? You would never kill off like James Kirk or Spock or somebody necessarily, you know, their main characters. And so at some levels, the violence almost, if you stop and think about it, you're like, well, they're not going to die. They're going to get through it. They'll find some way. And it kind of removes some of that tension and some of that apprehension because you know they're a main character and yeah, they're fighting, but they're going to win somehow. And it's kind of this interesting context where you sometimes lose that emotional attachment or that tension. But I like shows like The Walking Dead where you don't really know who's going to die or live this episode.
I was about to bring that up. Yeah, and actually, who didn't feel affected by Ned Stark going out at the end of season 1 in Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, you get attached to this guy, you like him, you kind of respect him, and they're like, yeah, no, we're going to kill him off. It has a huge emotional impact, and that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah, it means so much more.
Yeah. So here, we got another really good one here, and we're running a little low on time, but I'm gonna burn through these really quickly. So with the advent of immersive kinds of entertainment like augmented reality and virtual reality, does that change anything about the conversation about violence intersecting with realism? Is that going to alter how we react to it?
I think it's still falls in the same thing of it's more intense, but whether we're doing violence on a TV screen that's, you know, very violent, or whether it's in a VR headset and it's a little bit more immersive, it's going to push us beyond. And at some point, ESRB or some people might say that's too much, like, right? Because there is a little bit more realism in there. And there's probably developers that will try to push that boundary and see how far they can go. But I don't know that it you know, VR headsets and other kinds of things and other levels of immersion really change it dramatically, in my opinion. So it's a tough.
Okay.
There's a lot of question about agency there, right? Like, I mean, we already have agency when we play games, and we've, again, tons of studies on this. While these things do affect us emotionally, we've been playing violent games for hundreds of years. We've just gotten better at portraying certain types of things.
Right.
You know, I don't think it's made us more psychotic necessarily. So I think what happens is that there's actually there's a couple of different technical challenges when you start doing that. Like, how do you put the person in that environment that their actions don't feel floaty and synthetic when we talk about VR? So I think that there's other different parts of the puzzle here that's hard to predict.
Yeah.
But you know, so like, we're not. I think I'm thinking this because Troy said Star Trek. We're not talking about a holodeck yet.
Right.
But I think that in terms of how this is going to evolve, I think it's a safe bet that this is a relationship we're just going to keep negotiating. We do this with movies, with the different kinds of special effects. A great example of that is like Temple of Doom. In the original scene where the guy has had the Kali Ma scene and a guy's being lowered into the fire pit, they actually had to add a lot more baffle and fire to obscure what was happening because their special effects were too good. They realized, as I recall the story, they realized with the guys, this is, you know, a very dramatic scene. They're like, everyone in the theater is going to throw up. Like this, it was too effective for and for something that was aiming at a PG rating. They're like, oh no. So I think that, you know, that's why we do want to evaluate this material. I don't know if the dynamic of how we approach this is going to change, but I think we're just going to have to keep sort of taking a pulse check and looking at, you know, does this become a training environment for doing horrible things, or is it no? There's still there's context. There's gameplay, we're working with risk. And I really think too, if we talk about where we would want to consider how we want to portray violence and context, and that's really going to matter for the way those technologies evolve. But I don't think that's majorly different than what we do now. It's just changing the particular points of evaluation. That'd be worth working with some of those technologies. That would be my take anyway.
Yeah.
It's just you've still got that technical barrier. You're as immersive as it can get. There's still going to be that barrier of there's technology on my face, in my hands. I'm not actually the one doing it. I know what's going on. I don't feel like any resistance when I move my arms. Like it's all fake. You know it's all fake. It annoys me when people say, "Oh, you're fully immersed in the game." Like you're not really. You know that you've got a thing on your head. You know you've got things in your hand. You're pushing buttons. And so saying like, do we think we're going to get like less violent as we go forward with technology? Maybe, but I think we've got some time yet until that discussion becomes a real problem to discuss, because I say technology is going to take a very long time to get there. Whilst you still got to hold stuff in your hands, you're still going to be in it. Yeah, if you look at the films like Ready Player One, it kind of missells it because he knows he's in a van with this goggle on, moving things around, but obviously as an audience we see them running around this big city doing all these cool things and like really you look stupid. Back in the you look immediate. Until we reach the Matrix levels of VR, then we're in trouble. But
I do think to that, Ryan, though, I do think, and I would just want to add from my previous point, because I realized I missed this. I do think how we choose to rate it, or how we say what's acceptable for age groups or demographics or audiences, I think we might take some of those ratings a little bit more seriously when it feels more, more ultra real. Like, we're not going to put a kid into a Call of Duty game. We're not going to put like your average 7-year-old into that. The parents are like, oh, hell no. I mean, they don't do that. Like right now, I don't think that is managed as aggressively by the majority of people. But I think that even that is starting to change. People are taking it more seriously.
Well, look at, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, like TV, movies, games. I mean, this bar of things that are acceptable in our society is constantly shifting and changing.
Yeah,
right?
Not static.
Nudity, sex, violence, all these things. People keep pushing against it, and eventually ESRB or a rating board's like, oh, okay, I guess that's okay, like, right? And then we just kind of keep doing that, and for better or for worse, not saying that's right or wrong, but there'll be people who want to try to push it beyond the limit, and they may get push back and have to, again, censor some things or reduce it. But we have to, again, make that moral judgment ourselves to say, like, would I want my kid to see that? Would I want my, thing to do that? Would I want to see that? Like, right, where, and maybe I'm trying to do something with gratuitous violence, and that's not wrong to do, but do it with the understanding of why I'm doing that, right? And don't target that towards young children and things like that. Be a great human being and not just, somebody who's trying to do something for bad reasons, like, right? And that's what I want people to think about is like, again, why is that in there? And is that appropriate, right? And make your own decisions.
It's a point well made. And this actually couples onto a question somebody asked, actually James asked it, about ratings boards and whether removing violence from a game could potentially alter the accessibility of a game to a wider or younger audience. And the answer is yes. And there's a detail in there that I think is kind of interesting in this context. Most people don't know how the ESRB operates. So I'm going to explain it super quick. It basically boils down to small groups of people who volunteer to rate games. So to your point, Troy, about the expectations or the taboos, cultural taboos associated with games being something that's malleable and kind of changing over time, that's exactly why. Because these are just regular people, and they volunteer to be on a team evaluating games for the ESRB, and so they're bringing with them their own cultural context. And I would argue that's actually a pretty good way to approach it, because it's not some academic person, sitting in their ivory tower. It's not a bunch of game industry executives. It's just regular people, consumers. And they can come from anywhere in any context, and they're reacting to this stuff and saying, that's a little over the line. That's going to be, M-rated. That one's okay. Yeah, I know it's a little violent, but it's cartoon violence, so that's going to be T-rated. That's literally how they do it. And I think it's a pretty good compromise, because it follows the culture, right?
Yeah.
And again, violence with context isn't necessarily wrong, but if it's just gratuitous, it's there. And that's, I think, what people see again is just like, what do I perceive that? Was that really necessary? Did that really have context, and something that really made it a better experience, right? And is that something that's there? And so I think just again, thinking about those kinds of things in the same way, using nudity or other kinds of things, like, whoa, did I really need to do that? Or was I doing that just for shock value and just because I could, it doesn't mean I should, right? And
because you can is not a good excuse. It's absolutely true. Okay, well, I think we're basically out of time here. Did any of you guys have any last comments you wanted to add? Anything you wanted to touch on?
I would just say, for those those game designers out there, the industry is grown to the point where it's so varied, and anything is up for grabs. So if you've got a cool idea for a game that you think, yeah, this would be cool to try out, and you maybe are hesitant because you're thinking, oh, it won't ever be popular, or it won't ever find an audience, like, don't worry about that. Like, it will. There are audiences for all types of games and all types of mechanics.
Yeah.
So don't feel like you have to bend your game design to meet the needs of what you perceive to be the audience that you want to get. There's room for everywhere. You go to these trade shows, and I've played some crazy games, and like you think, like, this would not exist 10, 15 years ago, like, but because everything's more available to them, like, you're thinking, yeah, I'm down for this. Yeah, this is cool. I was playing a game where you are a witch and you have to rebuild your kitchen, and it's a roguelike dungeon crawler where you have to rebuild a kitchen, and I love it.
That's awesome.
It was awesome. It was awesome. It was really good. I was like, damn, I should have thought of this idea. But yeah, it's great. So yeah, don't be afraid to be creative, be weird with it. It's all up for grabs.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I find that blossom of indie development that's going on now, that's been going on for about 10 years, is producing more interesting outcomes than I've ever seen before. And I think it's inciting publishers to think about what they do in a different way that's actually good for the industry overall. So yeah, this is a great time to just get out there and try stuff. Maybe better than it's ever been. So exciting stuff. Well, listen, you guys, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I think it exposed a lot of really interesting questions and answered a few too. So thanks for taking the time. And for those of you who showed up for this thing, by all means, check for that email and go find the Troy's document, because I think you'll find it a really interesting read.
Yeah, again, coming in a couple weeks, we definitely will get it, and definitely I hope it helps you all, inspires you all, to think differently and at least think about all these problems. But, and again, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today, and I really appreciate your time as well. And I hope this, is something that will, stay in your mind forever, and it's something that you'll keep thinking about, and keep inspiring you to always be better in our game designs, right? So
yeah, right on. All right, thanks, you guys.
All right, everybody. Have a great week.